So welcome back, everybody. Let's scroll through to our break slide. So this is going to be the second part of your English lecture on COVID's pasts. So when we stopped, we were talking about pandemic plots and tropes, or rather we were talking about plots and tropes generally, and now I'm going to explain to you what that has to do with pandemics in general and COVID in particular. So first off, we have a lot of stories about pandemics, which means there are a number of genres and tropes that both, one, reflect what our culture thinks about pandemics, and more importantly, two, have shaped the way that we respond to real pandemics. So I'll begin by giving a really, really brief overview of pandemic literature. Stories about pandemics go back about as far as we've had written literature and probably further than that. For the purposes of this lecture, however, I'm not going to review the whole history. It would take way too long. Instead, I'll touch on two common pandemic stories and their generic assumptions and tropes from the 19th century forward, focusing on zombies, your reading for today, the Survive the Outbreak game that I asked you all to play through until you won. So, common pandemic story number one. I'm going to call this story The Last Man. So, at the beginning of the 19th century, at least in English-speaking culture, it became very popular to tell last man stories, stories in which a plague kills off the entire population of the Earth. This genre has stuck with us, so you can still see examples of this today, since many of our pandemic media are interested in pandemics that kill most people on Earth. So pause for a second to think, why is this story so popular, and what are some of its implications? First off, this is actually a genre that we have seen before, earlier in this lecture even, only about individual people. The pandemic that kills everybody genre is just the tragic disease story written large. We're inclined to see pandemics as world-ending. The unsettling implication is that it's easier for us to imagine civilization collapsing and everyone dying than it is to imagine a disease that radically reshapes society and our daily routines. We are already not great at imagining societies different from our own. Even more importantly, we also have an uncomfortable, possibly nihilistic attraction towards a world without humans. Climate change and nuclear apocalypse stories often function similarly. The implication of these stories is that they suggest we're aware of how badly we've messed the world up, and we find it more narratively compelling to think about letting it end than taking radical action to fix our mistakes. And let that sit with you for a second, and maybe after this lecture is over, ask yourself, why is that? I don't have a good answer, but it's something that is worth thinking about. And you can think about it by now answering quiz question number 4. Okay, so common pandemic story number 2, and the focus of this lecture. Arguably, the most important and influential contemporary genre of pandemic story is the zombie story. Zombie stories have been so popular in the last 2 decades that they have in effect become the location for our culture to work out much of its thinking about pandemics generally. Zombie has become synonymous in some cases with pandemic. For example, the game you played for today, Survive the Outbreak, doesn't even mention zombies in its title, just the generic medical term outbreak, which could literally refer to any disease. But you all knew that it meant zombies. So there's a lot to unpack in zombie stories about our attitude towards pandemics, and this lecture can't take 10 hours, so I'm only going to stick to analyzing the Survive the Outbreak game that you all played for today, and I'll go over some common zombie-related tropes and their implications for how we think about pandemics. And just FYI, if you are interested in learning more about these tropes and others, check out tvtropes.com. It's a great ground-level, entry-level introduction to some of the narrative devices that crop up in media over and over again and what their implications are for the cultures that produced them. And you should now be able to answer quiz question number 5, and it does require you to go to tvtropes.com's Zombie Apocalypse page. You can find the link for that in the lecture guide. Okay, so to continue, what are some common zombie tropes, and what do they tell us about our culture's approach to pandemic? So the first thing I'm going to talk about is what TV Tropes calls zombie infectee, the idea that because zombies are incurable, you should shoot them. An almost universal conceit in zombie movies is that you can't ever get unzombified. Once you're a zombie, you're always a zombie, and there's no way you can be cured, so the best thing that can happen is that somebody else shoots you. This trope reflects the older idea that pandemics are fatal and incurable, and we saw that in the Last Man genre. It also reflects our dichotomous approach to disease, so you're either cured or you die, there is no in between. However, our cultural saturation by zombie pandemic stories also has a much darker implication. In zombie stories, the sick are our enemies, and it's okay to let them die to save ourselves. It sets up pandemic situations as not only inherently competitive, more on that in a second, but actually suggests that it's okay to be violent towards the sick in order to save ourselves. In Survive the Outbreak, for example, this trope is reflected in the fact that narratively, the only time you are rewarded for showing compassion towards one of the zombie people is when you let a zombified former friend live so that later on you can sacrifice him to the other zombies in order to save yourself. In fact, to win the game, i.e., to survive, it's necessary to sacrifice him. What makes this especially interesting in the context of a game as a narrative device, rather than a movie or a book or a TV show, is the fact that a game is all about choices. It narratively forces you, the player, to sacrifice a zombie to further your own survival. In doing so, the game implies that this is an expected and automatic choice we face during pandemics. Either we sacrifice others for our own well-being, or we die, i.e., lose the game. It also implies that the right answer is to sacrifice them. Now, I want you to think back to this past May and also to the rhetoric of war I talked about in my first lecture. The war rhetoric surrounding COVID asks regular citizens to be like soldiers, sacrificing themselves for reopening the economy. Zombie movies work on a similar principle, so you can see the World War Z is even just making it literally into a war against the zombies. Only zombie movies are, as World War Z is and as Survive the Outbreak was, much more explicit about it. Zombie movies suggest that it's not only acceptable but necessary to sacrifice the sick in order to preserve the living, so, we kick them off the mountain in the picture you're looking at. TV Tropes calls this the guilt-free extermination war concept. It's one of the only stories that you're going to see in which it is considered good and unproblematic to utterly wipe out, literally kill, everyone on the other side. I'd also urge you at this time to think about how the Survive the Outbreak game collapses together the categories of winning and surviving. This is what war rhetoric does too, and those are not necessarily the same thing. And you should now be able to answer quiz question number 6. So a second zombie-related pandemic trope, which TV Tropes calls Beware the Living, is the competition for resources. So I'd mentioned that I'd come back to the idea of competition. Another very common trope in zombie movies is the sort of womp-womp moral that it's humans who are the real monsters. So you know the kind of thing I'm talking about. Usually, in service of this moral, we see a number of things happen in the zombie movie. There's an evil cult that you have to get rid of, your friend betrays you, you have to fight with other bands of survivors for resources, etc. Basically, many zombie movies posit that the post-zombie apocalypse world looks something like Mad Max, only unfortunately with fewer dudes with giant flaming guitars on cool rigs. What I mean is, zombie movies posit that after the zombie apocalypse, we're all going to be in competition with one another, and we can't trust other people. We have to look out first and foremost for number 1. This too is a trope, and it has some pretty significant consequences for thinking about our behavior during pandemics. What this trope suggests is that the default setting of a community during pandemics is competition with others, not cooperation. Many pandemic stories run on the logic that not only do you have to kill the sick, i.e. zombies, to preserve yourself, but you also can't trust the people around you. They too are your competition. In Survive the Outbreak, this manifests in several ways. For example, the story begins with a fight among the characters about what to do, and when the characters can't reconcile their differences, they split up, ditching each other to go their separate ways. In one narrative sequence, one of the men even attacks one of the women with a baseball bat because they can't agree on what to do, which, what the hell, guys? Even more significantly, you'll notice that the narrative sequence of the tale involves your lead character progressively leaving more and more people behind as he moves through the narrative. Surviving the outbreak is something you implicitly do alone. You don't help other people because you can't trust them to help you. They're not collaborators, they're your competition in the contest of survival. This holds true even if in one of the two survivor outcomes, where you get into a car and it's implied that the driver is already a zombie, so you can't even trust the people who look like they're willing to help you. So, how does this all relate back to COVID? Well, remember at the beginning of the pandemic when grocery stores ran out of toilet paper because people stocked up on ridiculous amounts of supplies, leaving other people with nothing? This is the consequence of the idea that competition, not cooperation, is how to handle an outbreak. People were thinking solely of their own good when they were stocking up because they saw the people around them as folks they had to outcompete for resources, rather than folks with whom they should share and organize. And none of this is helped by the fact that we already live in a capitalist society whose baseline value is competition. I'd even argue that zombie movies are themselves deeply capitalist for their insistence that the apocalypse should be handled competitively, not cooperatively. So finally, the final trope associated with zombie movies, which TV Tropes calls, and it's blunt because it's blunt, the white male lead. Finally, I would be remiss not to mention a trope that dominates a lot of zombie movies and, frankly, a lot of culture generally. It's on full display in Survive the Outbreak, the implication that you, the player, which in a video game is the kind of universal default setting, are a cis and straight-coded white guy. In a zombie pandemic, and especially in a video game where the goal is to survive, the obvious implication is that the people that we expect to survive are these guys. They are the survivors. And so part of this is coming from the fact that in most Western media, unfortunately, leading characters remain overwhelmingly cis straight white men. And I would hope I don't need to spell out why this is a problem. Okay, to spell it out, so just that we're on the same page here, most of the world is not composed of cis straight white men, so while it's totally fine that they're in media, everyone deserves to be there, they're vastly overrepresented, and they're moreover represented in positions that reinforce the idea that they should be the ones running things. But when we combine this trope with the setting of the pandemic, it becomes even more problematic. Think about it. If, 1, the lead character is the person who usually survives the story, and 2, if we've established that in zombie stories it's expected that those who live, the story's heroes, should sacrifice others to survive, and if 3, we are constantly told that the cis white man is the survivor, then, ergo 4, it implies that the least expendable lives are those of cis straight white men, or in other words, that everyone else's life is more expendable. We can see this pretty easily in Survive the Outbreak. Not only is the lead a cis straight-coded white man, but the only people of color we see are already zombies, and the most prominent black man in the entire game is a zombie who gets shot gruesomely multiple times, and it's really difficult to watch. Meanwhile, the only women our lead begins the game fighting alongside get sacrificed so he can survive. The lives of people of color and women are expendable, says the game's logic. And because it's a game, it puts you, the player, into the position of having to sacrifice them on behalf of your white male lead if you want to win the game, i.e. survive. So what does this all have to do with COVID? Well, if our pandemic stories tell us there's a particular type of person we expect to survive, it's because we live in a world where those are the people we do see surviving. And that doesn't mean that they are inherently better at survival or inherently more valuable. What it means is that we've set up a world so that they are the ones who survive, and this is reflected in our storytelling, in which the lives that are seen as more expendable are not the lives of cis straight white men. This is a pretty toxic cocktail, as you can guess, of racism, misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia, and you can see it in a bunch of places in the US's COVID response. Just to give you some obvious examples. So first off, the US collectively ignored COVID spread when it was in Asia, but suddenly began panicking when it began to hit European, i.e. white-coded, even though Europe is not necessarily white, countries. Secondly, the back to work and opening the economy orders back in May forced people in essential industries to work by making them choose between getting sick and making enough money to eat, and we are unfortunately still in that position. Those people were mostly low or minimum wage workers, a larger percentage of whom in the US are non-white and non-male. And then finally, as you touched on in political science, healthcare is unevenly distributed across the United States, and it's difficult to get if you're undocumented or live in an area with fewer healthcare resources. For example, Milwaukee's Northwest Side, which is both the African American neighborhood and also one of the ones with fewest hospitals. Healthcare is also regularly flat out denied to trans and queer people. And I could keep going. There's a depressing amount of lots here. But the upshot is this. The lead characters of our stories matter, both because they reflect what we see in the world that we have created and are responsible for, and also because they reinforce it. If you are always told that you are the character who makes it out of a zombie movie, even if you have to throw other people under the bus to ensure it, you're going to be more willing to let others take risks in a pandemic to ensure your safety and happiness. And that's extremely messed up. And you should now be able to answer quiz question number 7. So, in closing, to summarize, we have a lot of common genres and tropes associated with pandemic literature, and they shape the way that we think about our own behavior during pandemics. Stories are powerful. They reflect what we see in the real world, but they also reinforce it. Again, this isn't a bad or a good power, but it is a power, and you should be aware of it. And maybe the most important thing to remember, and I'm going to say this at the end of every English lecture because it continues to be true, language is powerful, and it does shape how you think, even if you think that you're immune to it, no one is. Much like COVID, very few people are immune to that too. So it's always good to be careful and stop and think about the language you're using, especially when it comes to topics as important as healthcare and COVID. And that is it. Thank you all for joining me on this appropriately zombie-themed October lecture. Remember, you don't have discussion section this Friday, so have a lovely weekend, and I will see you in the next lecture. Thanks, and bye-bye.